This Artificial Intelligence and Equality podcast is hosted by Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Anya Casperson. Together with Wendell Wallach and an international advisory board, they direct the Carnegie Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative, AIEI, which seeks to understand the innumerable ways in which AI impacts equality and international affairs. This episode features Angela Kane being interviewed by Wendell Wallach. It was recorded on June 13th, 2022.
Hello, I'm Wendell Wallach. With us today, we have Angela Kane, who has had an incredible 37-year career at the United Nations. For the last 13 of those years, she was an Undersecretary General with, at various times, responsibility for peacekeeping, management, political issues, and disarmament. She left the UN in 2015, but has continued to be in demand as an expert in international affairs. She's Vice President of the International Institute for Peace and a distinguished fellow at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which was founded by Sam Nunn and Ted Turner. And for those of you who want a little extra titillation, you may have caught during the pandemic the BBC One Netflix miniseries, The Serpent. Angela is a leading character in that historical reenactment of the capture of a serial killer, Charles Soubrage, who not only murdered, but functioned as a con man throughout Asia in 1975 and 76. And Angela and her then diplomat husband, stationed in Bangkok, did all the groundwork for Charles's capture. Angela and I have been colleagues and friends for many years. Most recently, we wrote together a TechCrunch opinion piece titled "Artificial Intelligence is Already Upending Geopolitics." And if you're interested, you can find that on either the TechCrunch website or the Artificial Intelligence and Equality website at the Carnegie Council. So that already gives you a sense of some of what we will be talking about, but I'd like to open just by talking with Angela a little bit about how artificial intelligence has upended the UN. Angela, you've said that the UN's focus on people and their well-being has been disturbed by the rapid and unanticipated development of AI and other emerging technologies. Do you want to tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you very much, Wendell, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you on this podcast. I appreciate your asking me for it. And I think that what we have seen is that AI has really rattled people. They have been very upset about not being able to control this. They feel that this is a development that has really overtaken them. It's gone so rapidly. And while the younger generation has taken very quickly to this new technology, I think the more settled and more older generation has really had a very hard time settling with this. And we have seen that also in our interactions in the diplomatic field, where a lot of people are not very well aware of it. And I think also when you consider how AI and technology has really taken hold, particularly in the developed countries. In the developing countries, it's still lagging behind a bit. There are large, everyone seems to have a cell phone these days, but on the other hand, there are other technologies that really leave those countries behind. And when you talk about what is happening in the UN, then you sort of say, how does that influence the work of the UN? How does it actually resonate in the United Nations? And I must tell you that it doesn't really resonate very well. I was very amused because when the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden there were no meetings that were possible at the United Nations, the Security Council had to meet via Zoom and had to meet via other technologies. And that was something that was quite a fiasco in the beginning because some of the delegates didn't handle this very well. They didn't quite understand. And there were some of these sessions that were broadcast, and it showed basically how far behind the UN and the diplomatic community in a way was also to catch up with this. Now that of course was remedied very quickly, so that was not really an issue after a couple of weeks. But on the other hand, how are we dealing with AI and technology development in the UN? And I don't think we're dealing with it very well. There was a report that was done by the Secretary General. He asked a group of eminent persons, I think it was headed by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates, and they talked about technology, but it was all very general. It was all like, we have to foster inclusion, we have to be transparent, we have to basically build on existing capabilities, we have to support the developing world in getting this, but there was nothing that was very concrete about what was the UN going to do. And that, I think, to my mind, is something that the UN still needs to sharpen their focus on this. And maybe it is now happening because there is a envoy who was just appointed by the Secretary General, who is for technology. But on the other hand, we'll have to see how he handles his portfolio that he's been given by the Secretary General. And let me add something else. And I find it interesting because when you think about how the international system developed, you had the Universal Postal Union, and that was like 150 years ago. It was 1874, I think it was founded. And what happened was the Postal Union basically set the rates, it set the conditions. You have the ITU, the Telecommunications Union. So there are always attempts by the international system to basically set standards. For example, civil aviation sets standards. We don't have standards at all, neither in the UN nor anywhere else. Some countries are trying it, the EU is trying it, but I think that as a general rule, we are really lagging behind in looking at this issue and actually setting some standards, rules, and regulations.
So you have clearly witnessed the advent of digital technologies coming into the UN system. And in fact, in 1995, you started the UN website, and for many years, you were head of the UN IT board. So tell us a little bit about how successful the UN has been in integrating these digital technologies and what that may tell us about its ability to be effective in terms of setting international standards, or at least leading the way towards setting international standards.
And thank you for referring also to the 1995 effort, which was really quite amazing because I had taken over a rather large division in the information department. And my then boss was extremely proud. This was in 1995. He had just launched a website. Now, 95, I mean, this is like cutting edge as far as everyone was concerned. And so they had a couple of pages, and it was basic information on the UN in English only. And so after about a month I'd been there, I said to him, look, when are the next pages going to come? Where's the new content? And he sort of said, new content? What do you mean? He said, we've done it already. I said, no, we have to put more material up. We have to be more informative. And then he sort of said, do you know something about it? And I said, well, I'm very interested in it because I think this really needs to be developed and it needs to be put out there. And this is where the UN really should go. And so he asked me to take it over. And for the next 2 years, basically, it was extremely time consuming, extremely, we had to code. We basically did it from the library. We kind of had this little pod of people who were working on this. Everything had to be coded separately. It wasn't as easy as it is now. And we were very successful with it. But again, what was interesting is because then the demands came from member states and they said, not only English, it has to be in other UN languages. And there's 6 of them. You have English and French as the working languages. So I said, fine, we'll start with French. And then the other ones sort of said, oh, no, we've got 4 additional languages. And that's Russian, Chinese, Arabic, and Spanish. And we need those too. And then the mission said, we don't have access to the internet. You have to give us access to the internet. And so then we basically came up with a plan where we would give computers to missions so the missions could have access to it. And it was really the beginning of a technology revolution, but it was within the Secretariat. It was with the diplomatic circles in New York and in Geneva as well. But on the other hand, it was not really making standards and setting standards for the whole world, or let's say to develop standards. But let me share with you the example that I had, because when you start a website and you have a sort of a site map of where everyone goes, and everyone wanted to have be up the first one when you click on the UN, this is what we needed. So I spent basically 2 years chairing a group that put together rules for the UN. And Wendell, that taught me that rules for the UN, even for the UN internally, we failed dismally because by the time that we had elaborated those rules, they were already outdated. And that basically made it look like it was impossible to set this for the wider world because everyone had their own pet subject and their own pet interest that they wanted to launch. So that was very, very difficult. And I give you another example, which doesn't make me very hopeful about the UN being able to come up with a blueprint for the world. And that is, we started using more and more technology in the UN. Give you an example for for translation, for example. Now you have excellent translation software. At the time, it was still a little bit in its infancy, but we decided that's where we're going to put our money, and we're going to do this because this will be an assistance to people. This was very much resisted by the translators because they felt they were going to be out of a job. And they felt that no software could be good enough to do what they actually could do. And that gives you also a sense that you have to involve people when you're trying to actually make progress and you're using technology in a way that you think is helpful. But if you don't have the people with you and they don't think it's helpful to them, but they feel threatened by it, they're going to resist you and they're not going to implement it very well. But what was difficult about it was that we had decided in New York we would have software X. And Geneva, which also has a very large translation service, decided they wanted to have software Y. And would you believe it that we were unable to combine the two and sort of say we will have one standard? And that, to my mind, was something that was incomprehensible. But on the other hand, there was too much internal opposition to that. And so it continued alongside on two tracks. It was not interchangeable.
So this lack of interoperability between departments, to your knowledge, has that continued since you've left the UN, or have any significant measures been taken to ensure that the UN at least has some standard internally for that or for cybersecurity, for example?
Well, the cybersecurity is a different issue because that is basically handled centrally. So it's not handled in each department, but it's handled by one department. There is a chief intelligence officer who basically handles that. So there's much more of a push to make it more coherent and also to make it more centrally organized and centrally regulated. But when it comes to the various IT standards, if you ask someone from the UN, they will probably tell you, yes, we do that now. So, they're probably going to say that you're behind the times and you don't really follow this. But I give you an example. I was head for 3 years of an IT board, an internet technology board of the whole UN system. And we would meet twice a year and we would basically sit together and sort of say, what has worked in your case? What has worked in my case? How can we be more cohesive? How can we exchange information? Is there a way that we could cooperate, maybe also buy software, etc., together, so you get a group discount or something, and train each other? And that was something that I felt very strongly supported. It was something that I really wanted to make work. But again, every entity of the UN has its own budget, has its own rules and regulations, that they're not very flexible. And the reason why they're also not very flexible is because member states watch very carefully what you're doing because it's their money. So they feel that, you cannot join this money with another source, even if it's within the UN system, because how are you going to sort out what are the benefits, where's the money going, etc. So that was very, very difficult. And we had it even so, there was a lot of secrecy about hacking at the time. And yes, it was like a year later that we found out one of the major entities of the UN was being hacked or was hacked. And they didn't even share this with us. You'd think that they would tell us and say, look, this has happened to us. Be careful what happened. And you have to watch out for any other similar hacking that could take place in your institution. And that to me was very disappointing. So there was I think there was a lot of goodwill. But in terms of coming out of it, it was more of an exchange of information rather than activating joint efforts to better deal with IT and also the purchases of software and other material.
As you know, that Anya Kasperson and I started the AI Inequality Initiative because we were particularly concerned about the ways in which artificial intelligence could exacerbate existing structural inequalities and exacerbate insecurity. So the exacerbation of insecurity can be evident in different ways, some directed at the those who have less access, for example, to IT tools, but also in terms of the major issue of whether there will be employment for them in the future, whether tech unemployment is going to overwhelm the global South, for example. So can you share with us some of your concerns around both how AI might exacerbate insecurity, both in terms of, for example, work and international security?
What has happened really, Wendell, in my opinion, is that certain uses of AI could really undermine international peace and security, and they could raise concerns about the security and the safety of technology. They could accelerate really the pace of armed conflict, and they could also loosen control over the means of war. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But I think that really it's exacerbating insecurity because people are afraid of what's coming down the pike. What is their future going to be like? There's a lot of insecurity about, will technology, will algorithms eliminate the job that I'm doing right now? What is the future of work for me? And when you work for the United Nations, you have a pretty good safety cushion in terms of not being laid off from one minute to the other. But that is, of course, something that is unusual in this world. And when it also comes to harvesting the benefits of AI, you really kind of wonder about it, because if you really want to harness the benefits of AI, you need huge amounts of data, you need huge amounts of computer capacity to basically, the more computing power you have, the better. And that also leaves the benefits and the power concentrated in very few hands. And that's primarily in the US, China, European Union, maybe Russia. But on the other hand, what about the rest of the world? And that is something where a lot of countries in the UN, and that's being voiced also, feel that they're disadvantaged because they're latecomers to this. They don't have that capacity. They don't have the computing power. So what does it mean for them? Why are some of these companies that are the big five, so to say, they are worth in the millions, billions of dollars. I mean, who can actually equal that in the developing world? I mean, you really cannot. And is there any hope for any latecomers to come to that level? And so what you now have is you have more and more look to sort of say, if these companies have all of these commercial activities, and the EU has tried very hard, for example, to sort of say, well, this exists somehow in the space somehow. I mean, on the cloud, on the computing cloud. But on the other hand, you have to also pay taxes to that. And that's been a tremendous effort that's happened in the EU. Now, I wonder, for example, why hasn't that happened in the United Nations? Isn't this something that should be regulated globally, so also that some of the benefits are distributed equally? And that's simply not happening. And I think it's not happening because multilateralism has really taken a hit lately. It's not a good word anymore. Multilateralism, 77 years ago, UN was created, terrific, and there was a lot of goodwill to work together. Then you had the Cold War. Then in the early 90s, late 80s, when the Soviet Union broke out, you again had this high point of cooperation. But right now, that is lacking. And I think that the geopolitical climate is simply not there to make progress on these issues. So it's being put on hold. It's basically being looked at in terms of, you have some exhortative words, you have some encouragement, but you don't really have any measures that you are implementing or that you are even proposing. And that, to my mind, is very, very sad.
We have been very interested at kind of the failure analysis of the multilateral system, and that has been a big theme for the Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative, with leaders like yourself who have had the experience. You've been in these multilateral institutions for years, and we think you can be particularly helpful in our understanding why they have failed and whether there might be creative initiatives we can take that could rewrite that course. So you just talked about how the multilateral system seems to be very weak at the moment. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how the multilateral system might become more robust or begin to address issues around to whom the benefits of emerging technologies accrue, and whether we can direct the distribution crisis in a way where the rewards of emerging technologies are spread much more broadly.
I think that is really what is needed, to spread the benefits more broadly, because they're not. They're very concentrated. And when you ask me what is the way forward, what proposals can we think of? To my mind, the best attempt that you have at looking at this is basically within the European Union right now. I know there's also been a group in the United States, but again, I think the political body in the United States is so conflicted right now, and I don't really see that there's a lot of way forward, because there's not the right political climate to really make headway on issues that are really, really important. But what I would like to see is that the EU, which has started about the GDPR, they have basically started to make rules and regulations. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But there is a thinking about this. And they put together a group, I think it was in 2018, and I was a reserve member of that group, to write some regulations for it, which I thought was a really good start. And what they're talking about, they're having some kind of responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI. I mean, that's one issue, is the trustworthy AI, because people are so reluctant to trust whatever comes out of an algorithm, to trust whatever comes out of these daily measures that are affecting us in terms of it's a chatbot, or you can't get a human on the line, or someone decides that you have transgressed in driving or something, whatever. But there is something that affects our daily life. So it's trustworthy AI is one of them, and they have made headway with that. But the other way is also, how should the benefits of AI be harnessed, and how can we actually support that the benefits are being distributed more equally? And that where the EU has started, and I think that that's very good. The UK has also started, and the US, but the EU needs to find more partners in this. They need to find more like-minded states. And that doesn't only mean like-minded states who already have good computing IT power, but it also means countries in the South who are saying, we also want access. We also want to see something that basically benefits us. We don't want to be, let's say, left out of this important technology and left out of this important market. So they could actually move forward on this if they find like-minded states to actually push this through in the UN. Is it going to be successful and we will have regulations in a couple of years' time? Maybe next year, maybe 5 years, I don't know. And that's going to be very difficult, because the decision of what's my part of this, what do I own, and what do others get of this pie, is going to be very, very difficult to negotiate. And that's where the lack of multilateral sentiment, if I can call it that, would be difficult to achieve. But on the other hand, it can be done, and frankly, it should be done. But in this particular point in time, with the war in Ukraine, for example, people have other worries right now, the energy crisis, climate change. So it's not really the main preoccupation, but it really should be. It really should be coming up higher on the agenda.
Well, what would it take for it to come up higher on the agenda?
You could basically have I give you one example. The Secretary General, he's just appointed this IT envoy, and he could basically say to the IT envoy, I want you to talk to the member states who have already expressed an interest. I want you to look at this body, this special group that was put together by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates. And by the way, the IT envoy was the secretary of this group, so he knows it very well. And he could basically go around and stimulate that. And the Secretary General could support that. He could call a meeting, or he could go to the President of the General Assembly and say, I would like to have a meeting and I would like to discuss this. The Secretary General is his own agent. I mean, he can basically suggest things, and he can get member states together and find out what is the appetite for a discussion like that. What is the appetite for moving ahead of that? That hasn't happened. It's been very piecemeal, and it's been very, very limited, and it's not been with the member states, it's basically been outside the member states, like with this expert group that he put together, now with the IT envoy. The IT envoy reports directly to him. And I think that there is a lot that he can do. That's something that needs to be socialized as an idea, if you so want, but it also needs to be pushed. And if you do that, I am not saying it's going to be blessed with victory right away, but it will get traction simply because he's the one putting it forward. And he is the one asking the General Assembly president to put it together into the General Assembly. And you will hear what member states can say as a response. What do they want out of this? Or is it just going to be pretty words and, one meeting and then that's it? But you will have to test the temperature.
I know that you played a role in directing some attention to lethal autonomous weapons within the UN system. I mean, I'm, for example, among those who was outside of the UN who was very interested in precipitating attention to how we might limit, restrict, put in place a treaty around ensuring that lethal autonomous weapon systems do not get deployed. But you had that concern within the UN, and perhaps you can share with our listeners a little bit about what you did in regards to
that. This is an interesting, sometimes, you have serendipitous meetings in the UN. And I remember when there was a United Nations Special Rapporteur, Christopher Hines from South Africa, and he had written a report that was published in 2013, and he came to see me. And subsequently, I learned that you, Wendell, were actually very instrumental in advising him as to what could be and should be in the report. So that was also one way of showing how one can actually.
Let me correct you a little bit. I was not involved in advising him on the report itself, but after the report, he was a guest of mine at the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. And we talked about some of these ideas and how they might be promoted and some of the concerns that would arise around it. So my influence was certainly not on the report itself.
Well, but on the other hand, it had influence also. And maybe, this is why he came to see me at the United Nations. And he told me about this report, gave me a copy of it, briefed me on it. And I find it funny because at the time he called it lethal autonomous robotics. It's like robotics, who uses the word robotics these days? Not very often used. But anyway, I was really interested in that. I thought it was just an amazing subject that he picked up. And it was something that I had not focused on, particularly not in terms of the human rights issue. But this became very, very important. And this was in 2013. So what is it? 9 years. And I tried very hard to interest member states in picking up this topic. And again, member states, the ambassadors don't read all of the reports. So you have to basically pique their interest and sort of say, this is something that is becoming important. This is in development. It's not yet developed. So how can we deal with it? And I did find interest among member states, happily so. And then 2014 was the first meeting that was called in Geneva, because one needed to find a home for it. How do we discuss it? Beforehand, I talked about the General Assembly. Well, that was too big a topic, too small a topic, maybe I should say at that time, for the General Assembly. But we needed to find a home. How could it be discussed? I mean, was it something in disarmament? And there is a convention which has a very long name, but it's abbreviated. It's like a certain conventional weapons convention. And this is something like a grab bag of a number of protocols. And there was one protocol that dealt with outlawing blinding laser weapons. Basically, laser kind of can be focused on your eyes, and then you can go blind with them. And they were outlawed before they were fully developed. And so everyone thought this was great. We had found a home for this. We can discuss it in the CCW. And so a meeting was called in 2014. And for 3 years, from 2014, 15, and 16, a group of interested member states, ambassadors came together and discussed it and said, what are we going to do about this? Can we deal with this? Can we put it under the CCW, develop an additional protocol before these weapons actually become released on the battlefield, what have you? And then a big change came. And the big change was really that there was a lot more interest, but also commercial interest, I should say, in these weapons because they're very effective on the battlefields. They could save a lot of boots on the ground. They're probably cost effective. And then there was also a group of international scientists and robotics specialists, so to say, who sent a letter to the Secretary General. I think there were 1,200 of them. But actually, they didn't send it to the Secretary General. They sent it to the head of the government, not the head of the ambassador who chaired these meetings. And they had told me about this. And I said, no, that's wrong, because what is he going to do with it? You have to send it to the Secretary General. And then they sent it to the Secretary General. But what happened in 2016, as interest became much more strongly focused on these weapons, but also on the commercial potential and the usability of these weapons, things changed. So while you had beforehand, you had a meeting of minds of the member states. They could get together, they could discuss ideas, they could put forward reports. All of a sudden, it was decided it had to be a group of governmental experts, a so-called GGE, group of governmental experts. And that probably doesn't mean much to people who are not in the UN system. But what it means is all of a sudden it becomes a governmental enterprise that is formalized to the extent that nothing can be done unless everyone agrees to it. It is a consensus rule that is insurmountable. If you disagree with a word in the report, if you disagree with a sentence in a paper that is being published by this group of governmental experts, it's not going to go. So what happened since 2016, and that's now in its 6th year, you have meetings of this group of governmental experts, but it is like, let us discuss, let us see. They still haven't agreed on a definition. They're still dancing around the pole, so to say, in terms of not coming to the nitty-gritty of this, namely, can we outlaw these weapons or not? Some are saying they don't even exist yet. Some of them are saying, well, there has to be a human in the loop. There has to be a human accountability. The ICRC, the International Committee on the Red Cross, has basically focused their definitions very strongly around this. And Secretary General Guterres has called it morally reprehensible. The Pope has weighed into it. But it's not making progress to the extent that you think you might have after already 9 years of discussing this. You might have the way forward to a convention or a treaty that would actually outlaw these weapons. I think we are further away from this now than we were 9 years ago.
Well, the sad part is that we're actually seeing not only non-state actors, but state actors. And even in the United States, we have companies using the Ukrainian invasion by Putin as an excuse to start building lethal autonomous weapons that they would like to send to Ukraine to help Ukraine in targeting the Russians. So all of this does seem to suggest that the movement to restrict the deployment of laws has more or less failed. And I wonder what you think the implications of that are. What does that portend for other security issues that emerging technologies pose for us?
What we have seen is that an increasing number of states are voicing openly their opposition to these weapons. But that's not enough. What you really need is you need an effort to say, fine, can we negotiate a treaty? Can we go outside the UN? Can we go outside this group of governmental experts and push something? It could be pushed in the General Assembly. That is one way of dealing with it. That's happened, for example, with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, where you did have an agreement, and that came into force within a relatively short time. You could also go outside the UN system, like has happened with the Mine Ban Treaty and some other instruments that basically failed in the international community, in the UN community. It just didn't go forward. So you could do that too. But the difficulty that is always there when you go outside the UN is that it is not really adhered to, negotiated, entered into by those countries that have a significant stake in wanting to see those weapons, in wanting to sell those weapons. And that, to my mind, is a significant drawback. It remains then a treaty that is somehow, I don't want to call it incomplete, but unless the relevant actors, the relevant possessors of this technology, the relevant commercial sellers of this information, they need to be there, but also the buyers. And that is something that I don't really know how to can solve this Gordian knot, because you can have it and you can have the ethical and moral high ground when you have such a treaty, but it has to be effective too. If it's not effective, there's no point in having it.
Well, it does seem that the Laws campaign did succeed in terms of establishing the moral high ground, and I think even convincing the broad public that this kind of weaponry should be restricted. But clearly those who lead the security establishments within the great powers do not want to give up the ability to deploy these weapons. And of course, as we're now seeing in Ukraine, even if we had a treaty to restrict them, there is no guarantee that countries would actually follow that when they are in a wartime situation.
That's very true, Wendell, and it's really very sad. But I do think that your point about convincing the public, there is a tremendous groundswell of opinion that really doesn't want to see that really doesn't want to see this happening where people press a button, or, you have two ways. I mean, you either have someone where you have action by a human who directs that weapon, or you have also a system where the algorithm can basically learn on its own and then can on its own identify targets. And the sad part is that it's very often not the military targets, but it's civilian targets, or it's civilian infrastructure. I mean, there's a lot of damage that can be done. And we've seen that in, as you said, we've seen it in Ukraine, but I think we've also seen it when Armenia and Azerbaijan, were fighting about Nagorno-Karabakh. They used very efficient drones at the time. So the warfare has really changed. And there is a sentiment in the public that is becoming stronger. And that's been voiced in opinion polls, that people don't want to see this type of weapon. And that is something that I have hope for, because it means also it can change. And I'm remembering that when the Mine Ban Treaty was negotiated first, there was a tremendous opposition, particularly from the United States. Mines are cheap, they're effective, they're also horrible. And I served in peacekeeping operations where I was in charge of mine clearance. You have a whole office and a group of people who are doing that. Very expensive, but it loses a lot of lives, it loses a lot of livestock, and it loses a lot of limbs, people who step on mines and they lose either parts of their body or they get killed. But that basically changed the opinion of mines from something that was seen as effective to now as something that is reprehensible and you shouldn't use it. That, to my mind, didn't really take that long. Maybe it took 15, 18 years. So there's hope in my mind. We've been dealing with this autonomous weapons for 9 years, 10 years. There's hope in my mind that this will swing around at some point, that actually there will be action taken to say, we need to outlaw these damn things.
Well, has multilateralism evolved in ways that undermine international cooperation now, or is this sort of how it's always been and it's just very difficult to get everyone to the table?
No, it's not been like that always. I remember that you had during the Cold War, you had a very strong bipolar system, which basically undermined this big sentiment of setting up the United Nations. And, but the United Nations is a product of the Second World War. It's no longer adequate to deal with what is happening now. You cannot have 15 countries in the Security Council with a veto. The victors of the Second World War are the ones that have the veto, and they have to agree to any change in the veto powers in order to make it effective. And why are they giving that up? They are not going to give it up. And what we have seen is that with the whole geopolitical tensions, particularly this year and even last year building up, the goodwill to cooperate has largely evaporated. You've seen Russia having a very independent voting part in the United Nations, in the Security Council, China very often abstaining. You have on issues that should be overarchingly binding people together, like climate change. You had a climate change resolution that was tabled in the Security Council just a couple of months ago. It was in December. And basically, Russia voted against it. And India voted against it, and China abstained. And what was the problem with this? Because basically they said, you're making climate change entirely you're making the Security Council entirely responsible for climate change, meaning that you have to take action. You're making it from a technical subject to a political subject, and that's why we are not supporting it. I think that that is incomprehensible to my mind. But on the other hand, there are a lot of initiatives that are stymied. And then you have something that is also happening. There have been so many vetoes in the last couple of years. It was something that was used very rarely, that you now have this General Assembly resolution supported by something like 130 countries, which is a lot, overwhelming majority, to sort of say, if there is a country that gives the veto of the 5 who have it in the Security Council, they have to come and explain it to us. Why did they veto this? And that was for the first time happened a couple of days ago, last week, where there was a veto that was cast. And basically Russia explained it and so said, well, you got it all wrong. And, we didn't agree with this, and our objections were not heard, and our comments on this resolution were not taken into account. So we had no choice but to veto it. I find this incredibly sad that it's come to that basically there has to be a justification, but there has to be a reason for this veto in the first place. And the reason for the veto is just a total breaking apart of the will to cooperate and to do things jointly, which was the basis of why do we have the UN? Why was it established? And how do we knit it back together again? How do we create this sense of enthusiasm about the UN does? The UN does a lot of good things that never get into the headlines. They're never reported on. And, you hear a lot about humanitarian action. You hear a lot about peacekeeping or peace missions. But on the other hand, there are a lot of issues on the ground that are taking place, and you never hear about them, but you do hear about the disagreements on the geopolitical stage.
Yeah, I think this is always very sad that the focus is so much on the difficult areas where the UN seems to be failing, and there's a lack of appreciation for these efforts on the ground with immigrants, with food security, with so many different subject areas where we'd be truly damned if we didn't have the UN.
Yeah. And setting standards. I mean, what I think is also very often forgetting, and let's come back to when we look at this autonomous weapons systems, is standard setting and treaties. You've had an enormously large body of treaties that were adopted under the UN auspices, also outside the UN auspices, and then brought into the UN. And that is something that is extremely valuable because it sets standards of behavior, and it regulates basically parts of international life. And what I mentioned to you is, when you think about, like even labor standards, the ILO, everyone forgets about the ILO now, but they do actually very good work in terms of, labor standards. Or World Meteorological Organization, what do they actually do? The International Maritime Organization, regulating ship traffic, navigation on the seas. There is, or like, can you mine in the ocean? Who can mine the ocean? I mean, this is a heritage of world, or what? Antarctica, World Heritage. It's something that is really, really important. And there's been a lot of good work, but no one really talks about that anymore because it's taken for granted. But we really should look at that again and sort of say, some of these treaties maybe need to be updated. We need new ones in some cases, like the IT one. But can you actually get a meeting of minds right now among the member states? And can you get something done of this effect? And that is something I see right now very difficult.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what's probably the most critical issue right now, which is climate change, and how poor the multilateral system has been at addressing it. And yet we seem to be getting an increasing awareness around the world that climate change is already devastating us. And I think presently there's something like 170 million people who experience extreme weather events in a year, and that's expected over the next decade or two to go up to 1 billion people experiencing extreme weather events. So that's refugee crises, that's all economic crises, that's all kinds of issues that are going to be daunting for humanity. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what we should be doing in putting in place more cooperation around climate change, because it does seem to be the one issue that has the potential to at least precipitate some degree of cooperation internationally.
You're right, Wendell. It does have the probability of working together. And what has happened in the last couple of years is that there's been this growing awareness that climate change is no longer something that's abstract. Climate change is something that affects all of us now. We're seeing the effects, and that's galvanized people to become more advocates as to what can we do. And I'm hoping that that will actually push people, propel people to be a lot more cooperative at the local level, at the regional level, and then also at the global level. What I see right now is there is commitments that were made. And let's not forget, the first climate conference was in 1972 in Stockholm. That's 50 years ago. I mean, that is just an amazingly long time span to be dealing with this issue. And even though it's accelerated in terms of, first of all, the science has gotten a lot better, the predictions have gotten a lot better. And what is very often overlooked is the tremendous economic cost of what does it cost of flooding, the burning of huge swaths of forest, of land, the arid nature where you can't plant anymore because there's no rainfall. And that's particularly prevalent in the South. And what happens as a result is that you have conflicts that are deepening. You have conflicts that are erupting over maybe arable land or grazing land. You have people who are basically not able to feed themselves anymore. So that is an source of instability that is very, very profound. And we're not dealing with this very well. I mean, you have people, it's like, well, I don't want to, recycle my bottles, or I don't want to eat less beef because it's environmentally, better for the planet. There's too little of that thinking. There is thinking about that among the younger population, but I think the rest of us in our age group simply have lived the good life, and the Anthropocene has really changed everything in this world, and we're not catching up fast enough to actually remedy it. But what is overlooked is the conflict potential that is explosive, about the climate change. And that is something that is going to be seen also because more people are going to be fighting. And we've seen that already very strongly now. We're going to see more migration to the north, where people are going to migrate to the north because they can't feed themselves, because they don't have a decent life. And that is something where it really needs to be looked at a lot more cohesively. And that's why this topic came into the Security Council. And it is incomprehensible to me that it's now being pushed back and sort of said, well, it's not a political topic. The Security Council is a master of its own agenda. They can deal with whatever they want. There's no rules and regulations. They're all provisional. They can do what they want. And they have. The first time this was mentioned in the council was, I think, in 2007. So, that's 15 years ago. And it's come up ever so often, but it's intensified in the last, I would say, 8 or 9 years. But now there's a stop to it. Now it's going to be very hard to talk about Security Council action on climate change. So where is it going to go? We have an environment program. It shouldn't go to the environment program alone. It should be a much more broader effort. And that's why you have also these COP. The last one was last year in the UK. But what is important is not only to set goals, but to make sure that they are being implemented. Everyone has the best of intention, I will do and set this goal. But on the other hand, if it's not implemented, it's not worth the paper it's written on, or it's not worth the speech that was made on it. And we also have the issue that you have countries who are saying, we came late to this party. We didn't use the resources that you in the developed countries used and became wealthy for. But we should not be paying the price for this. You should be paying a higher price for that. So it's an equity issue. And this equity issue is very strongly held. And it's the developed countries also who are pushing back on that. And so saying we can't do it all ourselves. And it's exacerbated by the energy crisis now. It's exacerbated by the war in the Ukraine. It's exacerbated, we're seeing it in Europe. where you have a doubling of the energy cost, it's the heating, it's whatever. It's going to be a crisis. And how do you deal with that? You have to deal with it individually in your country, but you should also deal with it on a larger basis. In the EU, they're trying it on a larger basis, but it's not being done other than in once yearly meetings, which always turn out to be somewhat disappointing in these COP meetings.
The litany of challenges that you've just recited, I think has led a lot of people to feel that the international order may be disintegrating at the moment. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I wonder what your thoughts on that might be, and whether we can revitalize it with examples such as the one you just gave, with the Security Council, if it wanted to, could really take up climate change in a serious way, or whether we're going to need new institutions, or whether the international climate is so bad at the moment that, yes, the disintegration is a real possibility.
Wendell, my first thought is that the Security Council is not really the right body to deal with climate change. You know, they can sort of, say something in support, they can advocate, but on the other hand, they're not experts in this topic. And to my mind is, yes, it is good that it's being mentioned. To my mind, it's good that it is seen as the nexus between security, climate change, instability in countries. That should be recognized, and that's what the Security Council should do. But what I really see is that very often what you need a charismatic leader who can pull people together and who can sort of say, look, not everyone can participate meaningfully in this debate. Let's have some thoughts here as to how we can actually do this. And I give you one example. Very often this work is being done outside the UN, but with somehow a sponsorship. There was a group that worked on water, for example, and they made a long report, and it was a very good report that came up with recommendations. How could you address, what are the thoughts that could be addressed? Then it gets sometimes a public hearing in the General Assembly, and then it's over, but there's no follow-up. But what you really need is you need some people or some person or a small group of people who can say, this is what is needed. A new institution isn't going to solve this issue, because the institutions we have, but a new institution is just going to be another mechanism that needs to be fed, that needs to be financed, that needs to be serviced, but it's not going to do it. You have all the mechanisms that you want, and you basically sometimes have to also go outside of a mechanism to say, you need to have new ideas. There's very few people, and I found this consistently in my career, there's not a lot of people who have good ideas and come forward with them and say, this is what we really need to do. But boy, if you have some of them, and you find some of them, grab them and make them work, and basically say to them, what can be done? There are people who can make a difference here, but I don't see anyone coming forward. And as I said, I'm disappointed that there isn't more leadership in this issue, because there ought to be. So, that's where I think not a new institution. It has to be a existing institution. It has to be something that could be created in an ad hoc manner, but not in a serviced manner, to the extent that it's like a structured institution, which somehow takes on the secretariat functions, etc. But what we really need is ideas. And why not? Look, there is a lot of global catastrophic risk talk right now. You have books that are written on global catastrophic risk. There are philosophers thinking about it. I attended a meeting just 2 months ago on global catastrophic risk, and that's from nuclear war to environment to disease. There's lots of things. Global catastrophic risk is one. Disease is one of them. And you talk about the pandemic that we are still suffering from, but you talk about SARS, you talk about H1N1. These have been diseases that didn't exist before, or if they existed, they were so small and we'd never heard about them. But all of them have come up in the last Ebola in the last 15, 20 years. And it's been ratcheting up. It's been faster and faster. So this is another global catastrophic risk. So how do we deal with that? And I think that we really need to put good heads together to say, how do we find solutions for this? How do we deal with this? because we have to deal with it. Otherwise, it's just going to swallow us all up.
So it sounds like you think there's too much focus on what can go wrong and not enough focus on creative ideas on how we can address what goes wrong. But if I heard you correctly, I think you're also saying it's not just ideas. We actually need perhaps even, relatively young charismatic leadership with the right intentions to really mobilize the younger generations to take up the cudgel and push aside the sloth that has gotten in the way.
I do, Wendell, and this is something, you're at Yale, you're a professor, you're teaching young people. I'm teaching young people too. And I'm amazed at the creativity sometimes, what they come up with, at the ideas that they come up with. And that's what I like about teaching, because all of a sudden you're all energized by this enthusiasm that they have. Do these ideas all work? No, I don't think so, but it doesn't matter. The fact that they are willing to put them forward, to fight for it, to try to make a difference, I think that's really what is needed. And I don't see enough of it in my current generation, but I'm energized by the fact that this is happening among the younger people. And maybe some of it is not in the right direction, or maybe some of it is a little bit fantastic, but it is so fabulous, that they are thinking about this, they want to make a difference, and they're actually convinced that they can make a difference. And that, to my mind, is also something that is important, that you don't give up easily. You have to believe in something. And they do believe in it. At least, the ones that I see, and they're not every student is that way, but there is a good number of them who are. And that's what I really enjoy about my interactions with younger people, because that's where I really see the hope. And then the Secretary General coming back to the UN, he wants to have a youth envoy. Well, one person isn't going to do it. That's going to be something that has to be a lot more, focused from the ground up, so to say, and needs to be energized. But I'm not poo-pooing it, because it's a good start. But let's just hope that there is more, how should I say, activism, but activism in a good sense that's also supported by the structures that already exist.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that so many of us share. I mean, particularly the older advisors to the AI Equality Initiative. It's how can we find and mentor members of the younger generation who have the potential to truly take the leadership on these issues. I, like you, am heartened by the enthusiasm I see. Sometimes it gets lost in tech solutions that are more fanciful than likely to be realized soon, but that doesn't alter the fact that there's a lot of creativity out there thinking about, well, what can we do?
Yeah.
Before we finish up, I'd like to go through a couple other topics with you, because it's not just been IT and climate change and lethal autonomous weapons that you've focused on, but you actually have been deeply concerned about biosecurity, particularly in the area of disease outbreaks. And even before we had COVID, you had some recommendations for managing disease outbreaks where the origins are unknown, such as H1N1, SARS, Zika, so many different diseases that could explode into being crises comparable, if not worse, than what we have witnessed with COVID over the last couple of years. Can you share some of your thoughts on that?
I first became involved and interested in it, Wendell, when the H1N1 broke out. And I was at the UN Secretariat at the time, and there was a whole effort to basically say, here we are, UN Secretariat, here we are responsible for all of these people who are out in the field, who are serving in peacekeeping missions, who are in, from UNDP, UNICEF, whatever, what do we actually do with them if there is such a outbreak of a disease that cannot be handled locally? And what do we do with our people? Do we leave them in the field? So we basically worked for about a year to set up protocols, what needed to be activated, what needed to be done. And it was a lot of work. And I realized that this was something that if we were confronted with not even a pandemic, but with an outbreak of disease that was uncontrollable, and that we had to take care of our people. Now, this was our people. This was the UN staff. and the UN system staff, I should say, and the peacekeeping troops and everything. This wasn't even the whole world. But I found that this was an amazing effort that we did. And then basically when you have other diseases coming up, then you had, the Ebola, for example, and I was at the UN. And that was, like, what do we do now? Head scratching, what do we know? And I mentioned that we had this H1N1 exercise, and, surely the blueprint still existed. And, I was one of the old timers, so I remembered it. Oh, that's very helpful, but other people didn't know that. But that showed me that you were really helpless if you were not prepared. What do you do in terms of preparation? And when I had participated in a conference to basically say, and this was based on the Ebola experience really a couple of years ago, like, what do we do in this case? We're not only thinking about whoever works for us, but we're thinking about safeguarding populations, preparing populations. What do we need to do? So I participated in this conference and found it extremely interesting. And that was organized by the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And there were more conferences. And then I did a presentation. And because they liked the fact that I came from a governance standpoint, not from a biosecurity health expertise, but basically from the governance experts. So how can we actually do this? And what happened was that in one of these workshops that was done is we came up with something to say, fine, if you have a natural health outbreak, then it's basically an issue for the World Health Organization. They're going to look at this, they're going to determine it, and they're going to deal with it. And they're going to tell the world what needs to be done. If it is a weapon, a bioweapon or a chemical weapon, you have a mechanism that is under the Secretary General that was used very infrequently. And the last time it was used was in 2013. And I was responsible for this investigation of the bioweapons in Syria. So I knew that very intimately. But if there is an outbreak of some bio event, some bio disease, and you don't know, is it a weapon? Is it a natural outbreak? But it's somewhere that's undetermined, and you have to find out. What do you do then? And so this is how we came up with what we provisionally call the joint assessment mechanism, which basically would be some experts who would work together, establish some baselines, use now, bio tech is very sophisticated. Talking about tech again, it's evolved tremendously, over the last, decades. And basically, if there is an incident, you could actually dispatch such a team. They could use some existing trained people already from WHO and from the Secretary General's mechanism, and they could go and be very transparent and say, this is what we found. If it's natural, follow-up action goes to the WHO. If it's an issue about a possible weapon, then it goes to the Secretary General's mechanism. But this biomechanism in the Secretary General's mechanism has never been used. So it's something that is now, with the pandemic, has gotten a lot of attention. And that is good to my mind, because we need to be prepared for the next outbreak. Where's it going to come from? We don't know, but we're pretty sure we know there's going to be one.
Wonderful. I think our listeners would probably hold me at fault if I didn't ask you to talk a little bit more about the events that are illustrated in the mini-series, The Serpent. As I understand it, in the actual events, you really played a very significant role, but perhaps your role has not, if not been diminished. A lot of what you do has been attributed to your partner, your husband, within the mini-series. You don't need to necessarily talk about that, but just tell us a little bit about how you feel about the series, what you think they got right, and whether you enjoyed it even.
Wendell, when you're, I was 26 at the time when I went to Bangkok, and I had been in the United States already. I'd done my studies. I'd been to college there. I'd been to graduate school there. I'd lived in France. I'd lived in the Netherlands. So basically, why not live in Bangkok, right? So I went along with my first husband, and you go to a country like that, and particularly in the mid-70s, it was very exotic. I'd never been confronted with anything like this. So what you do is you just kind of take it in stride. And I enjoyed it. And I learned the language because there wasn't that much English spoken at the time. I mean, people did speak English because don't forget, this was right at the end of the Vietnam War. So you had a lot of troops, also American troops who were in Vietnam, and they came for R&R to Bangkok at the time. But that was a particular number of people. But, I kind of gave guided tours at the National Museum because they wanted people to speak English to tourists who were coming in droves. And, I kind of traveled, I drove in Bangkok, I was totally, I was just enchanted by all of this. It was great. And then came this case of Shabash, and it happened, and those of you who have watched the series know that it happened when a young couple, a Dutch couple, went missing. And my husband, who was at that time a third secretary at the the lowest of the totem pole dealing with consular matters, so this came into his in basket and couldn't be found. And he had the habit of basically turning to me and coming home and sort of saying, you need to do this and you need to do that, because I'm very practically oriented. I can do these things, I get them done. And he wasn't. So, he basically liked to read a book and whatever. So I did a lot of that background work, which you're right, it did not get captured in the movie at all. But, I think what they did is they focused on one person, and that was he. He was the main character. But anyway, what happened was that we did establish contact with particularly the woman who lived in the same apartment building. And that again is very interesting because she didn't speak very good French, or she didn't speak very good English, and neither did her husband, who was the sous chef at the Oriental Hotel, and who wanted nothing to do with this. But in any case, since she didn't speak very good English and I spoke fluent French, having lived in France, again, I was like the go-between there. And it was just like, that's what one did. You get a problem and you basically get confronted with something and it becomes very interesting. You need to solve this. And we did solve it to the extent that we knew exactly what had happened. And it was proven that this Dutch couple was killed very sadly and very tragically. And that basically ended the case as far as the embassy was concerned. That's it. You don't do anything for it. But I must say that I fully shared the view that we needed to do more, because this was not an isolated incident, but there were more people who were killed. And that the more we found out about this, they were killed not only in Bangkok, but they were killed in Kathmandu, they were killed in India, they were killed in other places. And so that needed to be stopped. And the first attempt to arrest him, Shabash, went awry. He was able to leave the country. And basically we looked at all of the ways and gave addresses to the police to say this is where he could be, because we had a good knowledge as to what his contacts were and where he would go. And in the end, he was arrested. It took a long time. I have been, he's been in prison in Kathmandu and he still is there. I have been in Kathmandu repeatedly simply because I ran a mission there, and in my political portfolio I got there, and people sort of said, well, don't you want to go and visit him in prison? I said, I have no intention to. This is an evil person. I don't really want to go and see him. No. And he's still manipulating people to the extent that he married the 30-year-old daughter of his Nepalese lawyer just fairly recently. I mean, how can you possibly do that? But in any case, what is not coming through in the movie, because it goes back and forth all the time, it really was a very short interval. The whole thing, the whole nightmare lasted about 3 months. And that is not seen in the movie because you always have this flashback and forth and future, etc. But it really was fairly concentrated. And then, someone said, well, weren't you afraid? And I said, well, no. You lived in a house, it was all open. You had really no security, if you think about it. And I didn't think this guy was going to come after us. I mean, we were not his targets. And I don't think that he really knew what we were doing, accumulating all of this evidence. But it had a profound impact on me, because I felt also that you were very vulnerable, if you went out there and you were like a hippie. And, there were no cell phones at the time. It was a very different world.
Yeah, sometime we should talk with, some of my generation who also lived in that world and what they experienced and the degree of vulnerability or the degree of naivete we all had about being out there. Because as I understand, the serpent particularly preyed upon hippie girls and couples and so forth that he could exploit in one form or another. But let's turn to what is traditionally our final topic here. You've already talked about how heartened you are as you deal with young students and their enthusiasm and intelligence in trying to address the challenges we're dealing with today. And I wonder if there's anything else that you are witnessing that gives you hope.
I was about a month ago, I was in the Netherlands for a conference. And in the Netherlands, they have every 10 years, they have something they call the Floriade. And it's once in 10 years organized. I've never made it there for that purpose. And I sort of was determined this time I was going to go. And I had thought it was going to be all flowers. Well, boy, was I wrong. It was not at all. It was flowers, yes. But what was really important, it was a showcase for new technology, how to deal with climate change, for new technology, how to deal with waste, for new technology, how to build. And it was fascinating, Wendell. I mean, I'd never imagined, that there could be so many good ideas that were forthcoming. Maybe they're not all scalable, but on the other hand, there are people just like the younger generation, and maybe they are already the younger generation, they're thinking about the solutions. And I was encouraged. I spent the entire day there. I was exhausted at the end of it because it's a very large area. But on the other hand, it gives you solutions. And yes, they can be scaled. It talks about also, of course, the Netherlands has this tremendous experience having too much water. And where it took place was actually 4 or 5 meters below the water level. This is a new province that they created out of nothing, out of water, basically. But what I found surprising is that there are solutions out there that I certainly was not aware of. And that makes me hopeful that there is thinking about it, that there is a way forward, that we can actually deal with this if we put enough of our mind to it, if we put enough action to it, and maybe also if we put enough money to it. But there are solutions for this. And that was a showcase for what already exists. I found that fascinating. And I don't necessarily want to mean a plug for the Floriade in the Netherlands, but it was an example of what can be done. And there must be other examples in other countries, in other areas. But that, to me, in my mind, made me very, very hopeful that we can find solutions and we can apply it. But it needs political will.
That is the challenge, isn't it? That there are definitely some tech solutions out there. And for us, how are we going to reap their benefits without falling into the technological forms that lead to insecurity? But thank you ever so much, Angela, for sharing your time, your insights, and your expertise with us. As anticipated, this has truly been a rich and thought-provoking discussion. And if there's one thing I take away from this, and I actually take away every time I've talked with you, is that one person can really make a difference. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's very laborious, the results are not always sufficient, but you can set forces in motion that address some of the challenges that we all need to collectively address. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and a special thanks to the team at the Carnegie Council for hosting and producing this podcast. For the latest content on ethics and international affairs, be sure to follow us on social media at Carnegie Council. My name is Wendell Wallach, and I hope we earn the privilege of your time.